Today I'll be talking about the Messe de Notre Dame, or the Mass of Our Lady, by Guillaume de Machaut. So, the title of the work is Messe de Notre Dame, or the Mass of Our Lady, and it is a polyphonic mass, or a sacred Catholic musical piece written for multiple voices. The composer who wrote it is named Guillaume de Machaut. He lived in the mid 14th century in medieval France, specifically in Reims, is where it's believed that the piece was written. And we know that it was composed sometime before 1365. And the working theory is that it was composed between 1359 and 1363, somewhere thereabouts. So, as far as the context of the piece itself, medieval Europe, and France especially, was dominated by the Catholic Church. Cathedrals, papal chapels, and ecclesiastical institutions were dominant and were patrons of composers and the arts, despite a lot of problems going on in the world at the time. You had things like the Black Plague, you had the Papal Schism, you had a number of economic problems, but in spite of all of that, the Catholic Church tried to kind of hold things together, sometimes by force. So the Mass itself is kind of the centralized worship service of the Catholic Church. It's the main thing that you do when you go to church as a Catholic. Um, so it commemorates the Last Supper, and it's centered around the idea of the Eucharist, the ritual of consecration and sharing of bread and wine that's believed to be it turns into the body of the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. So the Mass itself is typically made of two different parts. The proper, these are texts that change depending on a number of things like ecclesiastical calendars and things like that, and they read different ones at different times. And the ordinary are texts that don't change. They stay the same no matter what. So inside the ordinary, there are five main parts. The first is the Kyrie, which is a plea for mercy. Then the Gloria, a hymn for praise. The Credo, which is a declaration of faith in the Nicene Creed. The Sanctus, the hymn of acclamation. And the Agnus Dei, which is a prayer for peace. So music would be written for the Mass to help set the texts of the Mass to music for memorization and for unity when people would be speaking about them in church during the Mass. So in the 12th and 13th centuries, we see the age of the Ars Antiquita, which is the polyphonic style or multi-voice style of how the music was written during that time. It's primarily centered around something called the Notre Dame School, which was a set of composers that primarily composed in Notre Dame and had a very specific style. It was governed by a lot of rhythmic modes, which at the time were limited sets of repeating triple-based patterns of rhythm. A lot of it was rooted in a different tuning system than we use today called Pythagorean tuning, and there were extremely strict rules on what is consonant and what is dissonant, what sounds good and what sounds doesn't. And it was divided in three as an homage to the Holy Trinity, and they called this perfect time. So around the time of the composition of the Messe de Notre Dame, uh, we see the introduction of the Ars Nova. It's a kind of gradual evolution in modal rhythm, and it introduced new subdivisions. It added the duple time, which is also called the imperfect time, as opposed to the triple or perfect time. And it developed a lot more precise notation for more complicated rhythms now that you have more things that you can do. It also introduced something called isorhythm, which is extremely characteristic of this time in music. It is repeating fixed patterns called talia against melodic patterns that are called color, and it just adds more depth and sophistication to what the voices would be doing. And at the same time as the music itself got more complicated because of the rhythm, it also got more complicated because we saw more voices being added. The 14th century had a lot of very simple chants being turned into multi-voice or polyphonic compositions. So, as far as contemporary significance, what it kind of means to us today, one of the biggest things about the Messe de Notre Dame that continues to make it important now is the fact that it is a masterpiece at its time and now. In musical pedagogy or just kind of musical education, it's taught as a masterpiece or a landmark work in the history of Western sacred music. We read about it in both in Catholic churches and in kind of secular musical education because it is the perfect example of something that is stylistic of the mid 14th century and highlights the things that I just talked about, like the Ars Nova versus the Ars Antiqua and the rise of polyphony. Because it's a masterpiece and because it's still taught today, there are a lot of modern ensembles that still perform it. It's a pretty popular piece for early music ensembles. Any group of musicians that focuses on um, medieval music, things like that. It's also got kind of lasting symbolism in the idea that it is a very early idea or representation of individual composer identity and the fact that these people are creating what is essentially intellectual property and they have themselves creative ownership over that property. Um, this is a time when the church would be sponsoring these composers, but had some pretty strict rules about what they could and couldn't do. And so the Messe de Notre Dame is significant primarily because it introduces us to a lot of ideas that before this time would not have been accepted by the church. But Guillaume de Machaut was able to kind of put his own stamp on things. Um, it also has a lot of liturgical significance. The ordinary, the texts that don't change, didn't change. They're still used today. They offer kind of a glimpse into the past or a tangible link to medieval Catholic practices and gives us an idea of, well, how did they do it back then? Well, they did it pretty much the same that we do now. And these are some of the works that I accessed in order to kind of research some of this, and I hope this was educational.